So this is probably not the view of Boulder that you were expecting when you clicked on this video. But before I tell you about the housing situation in Boulder, Colorado right now, I wanted to take you back to one of my homes in Boulder when I was growing up. Growing up in Boulder and living part-time in a trailer home that my dad owned for about 4 years, it felt like the most shameful thing that could have happened to me as a middle schooler. If I ever had friends or people drop me off here, I would have them drop me off at the corner of Valmont so that they wouldn't have to pull into the trailer park and see that I lived here. I just couldn't handle it. And there are trailer park stigmas everywhere, but in Boulder it feels particularly heightened because all of my friends were either upper middle class or, well, most of them were upper middle class, not upper class, but they all lived in normal homes. They had a lot of money because it takes a lot of money to live in Boulder, and I was like the one token poor friend that lived in a trailer park. Let me tell you, it was a weird feeling growing up poor in Boulder, because even if you're poor in Boulder, you don't feel poor because you're getting the benefits of all of the great schools, just all of the resources that luckily my family tapped into when I was growing up. So I was truly lucky in the sense that if you're going to be poor somewhere, you might as well be poor in Boulder. But there still was that shame of living in an area that felt so different. And there were subtle cues from adults. Like if I did have a friend's mom who dropped me off at my neighborhood instead of, leaving me on the corner like I would insist sometimes, there was this kind of pity, like, oh, you live here. And I know that was well-meaning and all, she wasn't meaning to be condescending or overly pitying, but it was. So this is all to say that I have a pretty unique perspective on not only growing up in Boulder and living in Boulder for a lot of my adult life, but being someone who is not supremely affluent in Boulder gives me some really cool information for you. But first, I gotta tell you a story. The other day, I was just casually browsing Facebook as we do, and in the marketplace section of Facebook, I was advertised a carriage house on someone's property that was being rented for $2,550. And let me just describe this carriage house to you. It was advertised as a tiny home that was 400 square feet, so basically a room that had a very tiny kitchen and then a loft, so there's a ladder and there's a loft where you put your bed, a very tiny space. It looked nice, it looked recently remodeled, and what they were really trying to sell as the main factor was that it was in someone's yard, it's someone's main house in the yard, and there's the tiny house, and the yard was very beautiful with well-placed plants and gardens and things, and they described it as being close to downtown, which I would actually say was kind of a lie, because I would say they're actually a 20-minute walk from downtown Boulder, but that's just me. But to get back to the price, $2,550 a month for this tiny 400 square foot little standalone house thing is deplorable, even for Boulder standards of expensive. I was honestly so offended that this woman would even advertise a rental like that I actually messaged her. Is there some really good reason that isn't showing in the ad that justifies how expensive this rental is? Because the going price for a tiny home or a carriage house like that in Boulder is honestly more like $1,200 to $1,500 a month. And this woman had the audacity to claim that land in Boulder is expensive and that was somehow the market value of the space. That woman is straight up lying. Boulder is very expensive. It is not cheap here. But to claim that because it's not cheap that you can just charge an exorbitant amount of rent that you've just made up in your head because you would like to make that much money off of a tiny house on your land, that is not acceptable. So now let's bring it back to you who clicked on this video because you are interested in either moving to Boulder or signing a lease in Boulder, and you saw this video and you're like, yes, especially to those who are truly new to Boulder and don't fully understand the housing situation that is going on here. Do not be fooled by some of the crazy rates of rents that's a crazy thing to say, rates of rents that some individuals and even some leasing companies are trying to get you to sign up for. And I'm especially talking to you people who really do have a lot of expendable income. And so maybe you could afford to spend $2,550 a month on a tiny little house where you don't even get your own private yard. Maybe you make so much money that that doesn't really matter to you. If you agree to pay that much rent and you decide to move into that place and pay that much rent, you are damaging the entire housing culture of Boulder. And housing in Boulder is already extremely effed up. And guess what? It's because of the very scenario that I just mentioned about the woman thinking that there's lots of rich people coming to Boulder. They'll just pay whatever to live in this little carriage house thing. When you sign a lease saying that that's an acceptable amount of money to pay to live here, you are crushing out everyone else that can't afford to live here, that can't stay here, even people that have spent their whole lives here, people like me. It's making Boulder more and more and more inaccessible for just regular effing people. Now here is the next thing that you really need to understand. There are only four main groups of people that inhabit Boulder, Colorado. There is the insanely wealthy, there is the normal people wealthy, there is the poor, and there is the transient population. That's really all we can fit in Boulder. We don't have room for a regular middle class. But because I know you're curious, let me define those categories so that you know what I'm talking about. The first population I'll talk about is the most visible population, and that is the normal wealthy people. The normal wealthy people are the population that define Boulder with the typical stereotypes you might know of Boulder. I would define those people as making between $80,000 a year up to maybe $150,000 a year. So anywhere else in America, they would probably be considered, middle upper class or even upper class depending on the area. But in Boulder, that's our middle class. Making 6 figures a year in Boulder is middle class. These people are the most visible because these are the ones who love wearing their Patagonia and going hiking on the trails every morning, and they got the dog and they got all the things. Now I'm being incredibly general, but I think you get the idea. When you think of the typical Boulder person, they're the people in this class. Now for the insanely wealthy class. They're hard to define because they are very invisible. They are so prevalent and they control basically all of Boulder, but the insanely wealthy keep a very low profile. But for the sake of defining it in this video, I guess I would say anyone who makes over $200,000 a year, but it's honestly just exponential. The rich people, they just make and make and make. And they have so much control over Boulder because they own most of Boulder. So these extremely wealthy people, they're the ones deciding what rents we're gonna charge. And when I envision them trying to figure out how much rent should cost, I picture Lucille Bluth from Arrested Development. How much does a banana cost anyway? $20? I mean, that's the only thing I can imagine was going through that woman's head when she decided that it would be $2,550 for her tiny house. Like, that's the only person that makes sense. The last two populations of Boulder are the poor and the transient community. The poor are my family growing up, often regular people who maybe if they were in a different area of the country would be closer to middle class. But by Boulder standard, if you are a single parent family that only makes $50,000 a year, you are considered a low-income family. And like I touched on in the beginning of this video, there are a lot of programs that Boulder has tried to put in place to protect the poor. And so they do have a presence in Boulder. There's a lot of amazing affordable housing programs. They are building all kinds of affordable housing condos and things. So the poor, they do have a presence in Boulder. The poor class of Boulder is also really the only place that you see any diversity. Boulder does have a large Latino population, but they are so invisible. That mobile home park that I brought you to today, that is one of 3 major mobile home parks in Boulder, and that is where pretty much all of the Latino population is kept. There is this very bizarre, unspoken, untalked about segregation kind of happening there, and it feels very structural. It's not like they're like forced to move there. It's just that that's where they always end up, and that's just how it is in Boulder. No one ever talks about it. The last population I will touch on, which is the biggest thorn in the side of the upper classes, is the transient community in Boulder that has been growing, especially since the pandemic hit us in 2020. There have been a lot more camps for houseless people around Boulder that did not exist before, and Boulder, both city officials and just communities, are scrambling, trying to figure out how to shoo them away and get them out. And really there is a much bigger issue, I think, happening than just wanting to like make them leave. And I'll just say, I know that the transient population issue is not just happening in Boulder, it's happening in Denver, it's happening in cities all over. But the way that Boulder is handling it is that particularly weird way that Boulder does things. So I give you all those definitions so you can tell me, where do you fit into that? If you haven't moved to Boulder yet, do you see yourself in one of those 4 groups? Because I'm gonna be real honest with you, people who don't fit pretty well into one of those 4 groups don't tend to last very long in Boulder. But I do wanna end this video on a little bit of hope. And that is, I really, really want you to get creative about where you live. If you're moving to Boulder, maybe you already live here, but you want to live somewhere else, get really creative about where you live, and don't just go for like the first luxury looking place that charges a lot of money because you can afford it, you're just gonna go with it. Don't do that. Yes, Boulder is in a boom of building more affordable housing, but they're also in a boom of building more BS luxury housing. And those places are exactly the kinds of places that are going to overcharge you rent just so that you can live on a street that is kind of cool and kind of close to downtown. And it's going to ruin over time rent prices for everyone else. It's been happening for decades. Boulder keeps claiming they're finding a way to stop it from happening, but it is still happening. So be so careful about where you choose to get your home from. If you're going to move to Boulder, please be a part of the housing solution and not a part of the housing problem. There are so many cool places to live, even luxury-esque places that are more in nature or they're in older parts of Boulder that are so fun, so comfortable, and they're reasonably priced. Well, reasonably priced for Boulder standards, but you know. So do not fall prey to the first hip place you see advertised. Not only will you be throwing a big part of your paycheck down the toilet for this overinflated place, but you will also be destroying the housing market variability in Boulder. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. I so appreciate it. And if you'd like to support this channel on Ko-Fi, I have a link in my description if you want to buy me a cup of coffee to help keep this channel going. I so appreciate your donations. And if you decide to stick around, I will see you in my next video.